All right, the time is 6:08 p.m. I'm calling to order a regular meeting of the City Council of the City of Sunset Valley, Texas for Tuesday, May 3rd, 2022. Switch fingers, get my gavel. And before we start citizen public communication, I did want to make a couple of statements. One is, Council, we do have a time certain item at 7 p.m. to discuss the short-term rentals, so where we're at in our discussions. If we haven't reached that item, we will pause for that. We have received 2 comments in OpenGov, and again, we're not reading comments, but I just wanted to acknowledge that there are 2 comments that have been made, one on the short-term rental, and then one about an agenda item from last meeting. And I did want to make a general statement about that agenda item from last meeting, because I know it's created a lot of discussion in the city, and also just, questions and, potentially things that might lead us to evaluate changes in our policy or our code, things like that. So I think residents are aware from a posted agenda item last time that we went into executive session to discuss the sale of real estate or real property within the city. I can't remember the specific terminology. And just to clarify, the city received an unsolicited offer for purchasing one of the city properties with specific use in mind. Council discussed that in executive session, and we're not going to reveal any of that discussion of what was discussed in executive session. And what I can say is that when we returned from executive session, we took no action. So that's the information I can share. It is our due diligence to evaluate, offers, and this was a real offer, so it was something that is our due diligence to evaluate. It does raise discussion points about, I think, transparency in terms of when the city may take potential action, or the city council, I should say, to sell or do something with city-owned property. We don't have anything in our code right now that gives us a process for that. And we don't have, and it certainly I don't think was my intent or anybody on council's intent to suggest that we were going to do something in the absence of getting public input, or at least weighing that heavily. And so that may be an opportunity for us to say, is there something we should do to codify how that process might work, even if it's at minimum a public hearing, right? To say, before we sell any city property, we are going to have a public hearing which gives us proper notice, and it's not something that we just come out of executive session and there is immediate action taken without any further input. And I think at a minimum, we probably should have something like that in our code. We do have a need when we're discussing particularly things that fall under the government code for executive session to be able to have private discussions, and I don't want to get away from the point of what we did was appropriate, and I think it's within our power to, as a city council, we are invested with that power to make these decisions. However, I do not want it to be something where we feel that there's not an opportunity for public to weigh in. And I think, like I said, in minimum, I'd like to see us codify having a public hearing in the case where we're talking about potentially selling or partitioning, city property in some way. So I think at a minimum we want to do that, but there may be other things that we look at in terms of that, any kind of process. But that's my statement. I want to make sure it's clear to the residents and to the community. We weren't trying to hide anything. We were evaluating a solicitation that came to us unsolicited. It was so it was our due diligence to evaluate that. And like I said, we can't discuss what we said in executive session. I can discuss that we did not take any action or chose not to take any action after executive session. With that, we'll open it up for public and citizen communication. So this is an opportunity for residents or members of the public to speak if they don't have a specific agenda item they want to speak to, or if they can't make a later agenda item. And with that, the public that wishes to speak.
Melissa Gonzalez, 26 Reese. I just want to tell you that someone is texting me and they say they can't find the link to this meeting. So putting that out there. And I asked them to text you, Matt. My comments are in reference to the work session. So I will talk about the things that I wanted to say then. The first thing that I wanted to talk about was I think that we really need to have a long-range financial plan analysis before we do much more hiring. I mean, I think that obviously Matt is a no-brainer. He's doing the work anyway, so we might as well make it official. But But we have not, because of COVID, done a long-range financial plan analysis for a couple of years, and we haven't looked at things. And I think especially with all our high contract costs, which really need to be bundled in with what used to be staff time, we need to know what this impact is on our long-term plan. I think that's really critical. So when we're talking about having the Finance Committee analyze the Texascape contract, or any contract of that sort, we need to have real numbers. Texascape was an outlier. They were always significantly less than anybody else when we would go to bid. And so I don't think it's the numbers now, especially with the new owner, are going to be a reasonable thing. So if you say analyze this, well, we need to analyze with a real number, and we don't have one. So I would say that's a difficult thing to hand off to them when we don't have a viable number to analyze for. When we are looking at these numbers for the long-range financial plan, I think we need to have real contractor numbers for what we were previously, pre this administration's time, paying for salaries, and which contractor costs have now come into it, and have that lumped in and do some analysis of that. And then you can, escalate for, yes, I know everything costs more, but I think we need to be able to have those kinds of analysis because there's a whole lot of contract costs that I'm not seeing the numbers for. And I'll just give examples. The additional engineering costs for the CIP, which we used to do in-house, the FEMA additional engineering costs, the higher IT costs that we often did in-house, the permitting extra contract costs that we used to do in-house. These things are not being bundled out. The permitting higher cost of service, since it's being done by the city administrator, all of those things, much higher cost of service. And then we need to go back to the previous city administrator, assistant city administrator's job description and make sure that all those things are covered, because I'm not clear that they are. And in terms of the city secretary, I think that's a really critical, we don't need a city administrator to survive as a general law city. We do need a city secretary. We had only one without the other for a really, really long time when I moved here. And so I don't think we should minimize the importance of that. I'm concerned about that as an HR function. When I was a council member in a fairly not friendly environment, I had to use the city secretary on numerous occasions. I had to get my things to go to the city secretary in order to get them through. So when you don't have a friendly situation, you really have to have a city secretary, because that's your point of entry for any number of things that you have to have in terms of process. So and the idea of that being some contract cost that's really heavily beholden to the city administrator doesn't sit well with me. So I would say that. And so I think that those are pretty much all my points. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Any other members of the public wish to speak at this time? Councilmember Johnson wishes to speak as a member of the public.
Well, sort of, yes. I read the comment earlier about the transparency, and I was talking to my wife about it, and I didn't have like real great answers. I just well, there's certain things that we need to talk about that can't be done in public, and like I have the statutes or whatever you call it open right now, and it still doesn't. It is more maybe a question for Barbara. Like, do we go into executive session more to protect? I know it's to protect us as the city, but all three of these things, there's like another party involved as well. And is it ever that they have a right to privacy as well? Or could we have come out of that executive session and it's like how the president can just like take something that is like a national security secret and just be like, yeah, I am declassifying it. And that could we have come out and Mark said like, this is the property, this is the amount, this is who, or do we have to? I just didn't have any of these answers. I was just, there's certain things that we go in there for, and I've just taken it for granted that it's like, oh yes, that makes sense, that we need to talk privately about this. But so like what? These statutes are like super short. It's just like, we can go talk privately about this, but there's not a lot of like, why in there.
So when you go into executive session, that is your privilege, you as a council. There are some things that are dually useful in the sense of that there might be a protection afforded to the other side. And economic development might be one of those where it easily comes to mind, where you actually have a dual help, I guess. It protects you all, and it also protects the individual that you are attempting to work with or facilitate or bring on board from an economic. But by and large, most of what you do for executive session is for you all to speak in a manner that is confidential, or you're seeking my advice, or you've got something that you want to talk about. You don't talk about real estate out in the open, because if you actually were doing a deal in real estate, you don't want the public to know, a competitor, so to speak, to be coming in and swooping in and going, no, we're going to offer you this, or we're going to do this, or whatever. So, I mean, there's some real world purposes for having some things behind closed doors. As far as the ability for you to waive the confidentiality, that is a council issue for you to waive confidentiality. It's not up to the mayor. If you all had realized perhaps that there was going to be many things coming out of executive sessions, questions or what have you, you might have been able to tell him, hey, by the way, go ahead, talk about this in a public manner. We don't care. But to the extent that it's after the fact, the mayor himself cannot, technically any of you can waive it by just saying stuff, but then you can get in trouble for doing it without seeking the permission of the rest of the council. So I'd never recommend that. I recommend that you all talk about it and say, okay, we're willing to waive it, and go on, and take a vote to waive it. But otherwise, you still need to keep that stuff protected unless and until, just as the mayor has to date, he's let a little bit out, but it's not like he's, given away the entire keys to the kingdom, so to speak.
Right, and so like when we have action that comes out of that, then it's out in front of everyone. But,
yes.
And this is like the question that like kind of blew my mind that Catherine had, which was like, isn't no action kind of an action? And I was like, it kind of is, it just quietly like fades off into the distance. And then that is where the public is almost not served by, that executive session. And it's just, I don't know, I'll noodle on it more, but I totally get Phil's point that it's just like, well, what happened? It's like, we have no action. And it's like, well,
I think really what the gist of that question is, well, what were you talking about? You came out, you took no action. What were you talking about? What was the item? Where was it? What was the amount? What were you even talking about? They want to know the details. And that may or may not have been something that you were willing as a council to tell them at that point. And especially if you were willing to even kind of sort of consider it at some point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Rosengren?
I just want to clarify, because when we keep saying we took no action, we did take an action. We said no. We took no action. That's the same as saying no. So
Point of order, you're not being recorded as far as I can tell. And I'm having people tell me that. So, but I'm just saying, if you're going forward and you want this to be your minutes, you are not being recorded. And there are people who are trying to listen and they can't get on. I understand, but if you keep talking,